Welcome back. We have missed you since our last episode in February. I hope you're all well and practicing safe behaviors. Maintaining physical and mental health is challenging during these unprecedented times as we negotiate a pandemic, unemployment, and other economic hardships, and a reckoning with our racial past. Tonight is about healing, and it is my hope you'll find some hints on how to deal with current life stresses after tonight's discussion. Good evening and welcome to our first virtual Sweet Thursday event. Please bear with us as we use Zoom webinar for the first time, hopefully without major technical glitches. By now, most of you have used Zoom, mostly in the meeting format. Tonight we'll be using webinar. We will not see or hear you. We will not have chat or raise your hand features on, but rather Q&A will be enabled about 30 minutes into the program where you can type in your questions and I'll pass them along to our guest, Dr. Li. Those will be anonymous. Sweet Thursday, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is the author series hosted by the Friends of the Lafayette Library. My name is Jeff Deepen, and I'm the coordinator and tonight's moderator. This evening, I'm eager to explore with our guest, Dr. Cynthia Li, a constellation of wide-ranging but related topics, including autoimmune disorders, inflammation, chronic fatigue, and environmental toxins and irritants, and how functional medicine can supplement the traditional Western medical approach to health. This will begin with a discussion of her own personal journey through a disabling illness lasting years, as chronicled in her new book, Brave New Medicine. I want to thank the Library Foundation who are hosting tonight's Zoom event, especially Sarah Blumenfeld working in the background. I also thank the library staff, including Chris Gray and Vicky Shaka, and my Sweet Thursday committee members, Ruthie Thornburg and Robin Holt. COVID-19 has sidelined most of the library's activities for the past few months, but look for updates as services are gradually restored. As of today, front door service is available for books and other materials checked out online. The Friends Bookstore, the proceeds of which pay for several library programs, remains closed but is preparing for reopening after details are worked out with the city and county. Sorry, we have no cookies tonight. Signed copies of Dr. Li's book can be purchased at Orinda Books. Please go to their website or give them a call to order your book. As always, Sweet Thursdays takes the summer off. We intend to resume in September, likely virtual for the rest of the year. Tonight, we're in for a treat, and we are pleased to host Dr. Cynthia Li. Dr. Li trained at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas and has practiced internal medicine in a variety of settings, including Kaiser Permanente in San Francisco General Hospital, St. Anthony's Medical Clinic for the Homeless, and Doctors Without Borders in China. All this before an illness sidelined her for years and led her to study functional medicine, which she will describe for us. She now practices integrative and functional medicine in Berkeley. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, Thrive Global, and Psychology Today. In addition to Brave New Medicine, she has a new free ebook about COVID-19, which you can find on her website, and we'll talk about it tonight. Cynthia, welcome to the Lafayette Library and Learning Center. Although painful at times reading about your suffering, I really enjoyed your book. We doctors trained in the Western methods can effectively diagnose and treat a great many diseases, but the approach does not work well for all illnesses. Much of Brave New Medicine describes your years-long illness early in your career. Can you please describe that illness and how it led to your change in directions, both your personal life and in your practice?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Jeff, for having me here. It's a real pleasure. And I would just say, just during these times, this type of exploration and dialogue, I think, is deeply, deeply necessary and timely. And so what we'll talk about tonight is really my journey and sort of what I learned along that journey, but also it's incredibly applicable to, when we're looking in terms of systems, whether it's global systems or systems within our body. We begin to understand that healing is very similar in terms of patterns, and so is inflammation, whether it's in the body or at the level of society. So and I look forward to the Q&A just to see really what's on the hearts and minds of all the listeners here. But so I'll just briefly go into my story, which is really a decades-long journey. But in 2005, I was really at the height of my young life. I was a few years out of residency training. I was working at an underserved clinic. I was doing also international aid work in China, right? And I'm ethnically Chinese. There was a tremendous amount of meaning for me to be working with underserved communities in my lineage, in the country of my lineage. I had met the love of my life. We had traveled the world, and then I was a new mother. So I was both sort of professionally and also personally at a real height in my life. And with regards to work, I had the sense of mastery, right? I mean, you remember, Jeff, what it was like, coming out of residency, right? Just the latest research is just, you can just recite it over and over and over again. The latest procedures, the latest drugs, the protocols, and being young, there's not that sense of overwhelming fatigue either. It's like, you could really, really see many patients and feel like you were doing a lot. So a big shift for me, though, professionally, was that I had gone from largely inpatient training to outpatient medicine. And I was already beginning to see that there was a huge difference. In an inpatient setting, even though I was an internist trained in chronic diseases, what we were really trained to do was to treat acute manifestations of chronic diseases. We weren't really managing or treating or healing chronic diseases. So suddenly I'm in the outpatient setting, and I began to already have a lot of questions and a lot of frustrations, and the same patients were coming back to me over and over and over again. So I was beginning to feel the inklings of burnout, just with the limitation of tools in my medical bag. And it was at this time when, I was a new mother, and a few months later developed sort of a panoply of mysterious symptoms, which is, very, very common. And long story short, I was an autoimmune form of thyroid condition called postpartum thyroiditis, and it's the postpartum form of Hashimoto's, which affects millions of people around the world, more women than men. So this was my entry into being on the other side of the bedside. And I did the very conventional route. I sought out a top-notch specialist, had been on medications. I was overactive, then underactive. My hormones were kind of a mess. I was exhausted. I was a new mother. But my life I was still functional. I was still working. I was still, a mother, still traveling. And the real turning point for me was at the beginning of my second pregnancy, which happened about 2.5 years later. And I was on a trip in Beijing visiting my family, and I had suddenly lost consciousness. And when I came to in the emergency room, I didn't recognize the body that I was in. So it was the beginning of chronic vertigo and disequilibrium, the beginning of profound fatigue, flu-like illnesses, flu-like symptoms for years. And this was both a medical crisis, a mental crisis, because medicine had really no good answers for conditions like these. And the primary diagnoses I had were chronic fatigue syndrome and dysautonomia, which is a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. So the automatic functions we take for granted, like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, body temperature, all those things were really in disarray. So internally, I felt a lot of chaos and a lot of anxiety crept up because I felt like I was completely out of control and that I could pass out at any moment. So this was also an existential crisis because as an internist trained the way that I was trained, I did not fit into my own paradigm of what I believed reality and truth, with a capital T, to be. So it began a decade-long journey looking into the questions of both what does it mean to be alive, what is health, what is disease, and really also desperately searching for answers to help me crawl out of the hole. So Brave New Medicine is both a stepwise journey of the science that I dove into, really going back to fundamentals of pathology 101, right? How did chronic diseases begin? And they often begin years or decades before a diagnosis can be made. So I began to trace back where these imbalances began and the deficiencies began. But more importantly, if I could identify those, that I could try to rebalance those or to replete the deficiencies to stepwise build myself back up to health. And this would eventually lead me into integrative medicine, which is really sort of what we think of as lifestyle medicine, right? Looking at different modalities, mind-body practices, nutrition, exercise, sleep, just ways in which we can support our body to heal so that the body sort of rights itself. And then I went a step deeper, which is functional medicine, which incorporates a lot of the same principles as integrative medicine, but also goes a step deeper into looking at root causes of chronic disease. So really breaking it down into 5 different categories. Like, are there hidden allergens that I'm just unknowingly ingesting or breathing or being exposed to? Is there a stealth infection that's just, not enough to be diagnosed by conventional medicine, but really just enough to cause chronic inflammation? Is there toxins or pollutants that I'm being exposed to? And if so, how do I detox from that? So, stress, existential, physical, emotional, mental, how do I reduce that? Like really, really begin to heal that instead of just kind of coping mechanisms. And then the last one is really looking at a processed diet. What does low inflammation in terms of a diet look like? And there's so many different diets. So it was a saving grace. It was also overwhelming. And I experience that now when I see patients as well. We kind of go from having no choices to seemingly infinite choices, right? So if that diet doesn't work, then you try this diet. If that diet doesn't work, then try this one. All right, this practice, no, that practice. This supplement, these other supplements. So it really very reluctantly forced me into, which is what I describe in a separate thread in the book, is developing intuition. And I did not know that intuition was something like art or music. It's something that can be developed if we practiced and we know how it is to develop it. And just like art or music, all of us are we begin at a different starting point, but no matter where we are, we can all develop it. So I began to learn and practice how to do that, and began to hone in on things that might be better for me versus things that might be setting me back. So it's really a merge between the science, the cutting edge science, and the art of healing. And how do we bring those together? How did I do that in my personal life, right? Because illness does not just affect one person in a vacuum. It really affects my beloveds that I live with, my extended family and community. And so how do we heal it together when everybody's really just trying to survive? So really at the core of this medical memoir is a love story. The exploration of grief, of love, of not just of others, but really of myself. And one last thing I want to say just about my journey and the story is that I was raised in the heartland of Texas in an evangelical community. So, and my parents were the founding members of the church that I grew up in. So I had I was part of the family that was in this sort of pastor's, I was sort of a pastor's kid equivalent. And we were this model family with, an incredible amount of grief that had never been talked about going on. And so with this dualistic notion of heaven and hell and suffering and, being chosen, belonging and not belonging, this also being in Texas at a time when there were very few minorities, at least where we were, was also, the experiences of hard racism versus soft racism, and looking at societal stresses, contributors to chronic disease and inflammation. So these are all really threads, again, that are through an individual story that can be really extrapolated to so many different people, but also to communities as well.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. That it's so hard to really capsulize the full breadth of the book, and your actually health journey. You kind of minimize it in your description right now. It's actually, like I said, pretty painful to listen to. You were really bedbound for quite a while, and then gradually built your strength up. But pieces of this I'd like to explore with you. For the audience, can you just tell us what autoimmunity is and how it relates to chronic fatigue, and those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. So chronic fatigue syndrome and a lot of the syndromes that are associated with it, fibromyalgia is one, dysautonomia that I mentioned is very, very commonly sort of just bound together with chronic fatigue syndrome. So there are a lot of chronic inflammatory, these complex conditions where multiple systems in the body are not working properly. So the immune system, the hormone system, the nervous system, the digestive system. All these systems are interrelated. We're like a big web, right? So if one begins to pull, the entire thing begins to shift. And the saving grace is that when we begin to heal, when we begin to pull it back the other way, right, the other systems begin to heal as well. So it's not just like, oh my God, you've got every single system in your body that's affected, and we're gonna tackle them one by one, which is actually how conventional medicine approaches it. But really, when we're looking at integrative medicine and functional medicine, going to the roots, the whole thing begins to shift. And so that is the saving grace, but it's also the complex problem with a lot of these conditions. So chronic fatigue is chronic fatigue syndrome, which is interesting now. Actually, it's estimated that somewhere around 30% of patients with COVID illness, moderate to severe, are actually experiencing a chronic fatigue-like syndrome. And so a lot of the patients I've been working with lately fall into that category. And, you know, there's tremendous post-exertional fatigue. And it's not just, oh, I exercised and I, you know, feel really tired. I mean, it's like a collapse of the stress systems. You know, the blood pressure can tend to tank. You get this vengeance of feeling like you have the flu again, and really putting people back into bed and unable to get out of bed. So it's a very debilitating condition. And yeah, as you said, I was bedbound for 6 months and housebound for 2 years, and largely housebound for the greater part of a decade. So it's had I known what I know now, I mean, I think it would have been much quicker. But I also wouldn't have learned what I apparently needed to learn to go back into medicine and practice in a very different way. It was also my very analytical mind. I was very stubborn, right? I had a lot of resistance. The intuition piece, forget it. Like, I was just not going there. And so the resistance, I'm also understanding, is a big piece of my personal healing journey and the chronicity of it. So with autoimmunity, the immune system is, when we call it self-attacking self, right? So the immune system begins to attack specific organs depending on what the condition is. But generally what we're finding now is that even though one particular organ is largely affected, like let's say with my thyroiditis, largely in the thyroid, the inflammation is actually really, really widespread. So most patients who have, if you have rheumatoid arthritis, most patients will still feel, oh my God, my whole body is stiff. My whole body feels achy, and I have malaise. I can't think straight. You know, I have rashes. And so this is what we're seeing across the board. There's also a phrase now, to be more medically precise, but autoinflammatory, which is slightly different, but it's just like this, that there's this chronic low-grade inflammation that's happening. It's not quite autoimmune, you know, it's not attacking a tissue per se, but it's just enough, again, to contribute to low energy, to brain fog, you know, just to, you know, sort of non-specific aches and pains and stiffness. So that can be happening at the cellular level. And one other thing I want to say about autoimmunity is that when we begin looking at root causes and we begin digging in ways that go outside of the conventional model, let's say I find that somebody has a stealth parasite in their gut, and we treat that. A lot of times their autoimmune condition will resolve. And so sometimes what's happening with autoimmunity is that the body's actually trying to heal. There's something there that we haven't yet recognized in more mainstream medicine. And so the body's just reacting. One thing with thyroid autoimmune diseases we're seeing is Epstein-Barr virus, right? That there's Epstein-Barr in these patients with thyroiditis. And so is the body actually just responding and trying to eradicate or diminish that infection?
And adversely affect many other organ systems.
Absolutely.
And in the case of COVID, which you mentioned, you know, a lot of the at least the more seriously affected people, and in their lungs, it's sort of like hyperinflammation,
Yes.
and the overreaction to the virus, which seems to be somewhat unique to it, causes much of that cellular destruction, some of which is turning out to be probably going to be chronic with permanent scarring. And these people will be pulmonary cripples, the ones that get off the ventilator, some of them. So yeah, it seems to be all tied in, and it makes sense now that I have a different way of thinking about it. You described yourself as skeptical, and which I think is common among physicians of our training, because we follow the scientific method. You used one passage I liked. It was called, you said, it's a skepticism is a shield against untruth, which it is, but also from undiscovered truths. And you contrast this with discovery and how children react by saying a lot of yeses. how did you overcome your skepticism, or have you, at least not, maybe not fully, to approach your illness and illness in general in a less traditional way?
Well, I mean, like I said, it was not something that I went into. I mean, it was like, I mean, I was on the edge of life, and that's what it took for me to begin to think differently. You know, so it was not something that I let go of easily. And I for a while, I didn't even know I was skeptical. I thought it was very analytical and very, like, I was a critical thinker. But now that I have let go of the skepticism, I can feel the difference. There's a profound difference between being a critical analytical thinker and a skeptic. And it's this presence of strong resistance. It takes a lot of energy to be skeptical. And it's also fear-based. So that's why it took me so long to go to life's edge, to let go of that. It felt like I was dying, right? It felt like I was just exposing myself to everything and anything, and, you know, God only knows what's out there in terms of, you know, coming outside of that umbrella of skepticism or the shield of skepticism. And now, I mean, I feel like I'm very open. I'm very open, but, you know, the flip side of that is to be like just completely naive and just, you know, kind of go with the flow with anything. So it's really a partnership between being analytical and using that, right, that as a tool, but together with being open to direct experience, which is what intuition is. And what I've learned too, the more I sort of put myself out there amongst doctors who are sort of the, you know, notorious group of skeptics, so many of us use intuition, and there's studies about it too. We don't name it, and also we're discouraged within our culture to name it because it's not scientific. So, so yeah, I mean, I didn't overcome it with any grace by any measure. But now that I am on the other side of it, I see how much energy it took. You know, so in terms of chronic fatigue, there were a lot of undercurrents that took a lot of energy out of me. And I can feel it much more now. I mean, I can feel the resistance in my body.
One thing I liked about the book is you didn't like completely go over and say, you know, things that have no level of proof, but the balance was there. You said, well, maybe there's something to this. And a lot of what you do that other doctors don't, you also list some scientific support for it. It might not be randomized controlled trials like we like and things like that, but I thought the balance was nice. And this coming from an equally skeptical background, where we're prove it first and then I'll believe it kind of approach.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the challenge with the way our system is set up is the randomized controlled trials are wonderful and they're important, particularly for procedures and drugs with considerable side effects, right? And we're really trying to see what's going to work for a large group of people with minimal side effects and minimal, deaths and bad outcomes. But in terms of caring for someone with chronic disease, it's highly personalized. And so, like, my thyroiditis is going to be very different than somebody else's thyroiditis. And the causes of my thyroiditis are going to be different than 50 other people's causes of thyroiditis. So that's never going to be captured in a randomized controlled trial. And so we're beginning to or it's already underway, but to redesign the ways in which we are studying designing scientific studies, where we begin to look at people as, maybe we'll say we've got 300 people with high blood pressure, but then they go and they do their personalized regimens, and then we look at the outcomes. And so we're more looking at whole approaches as opposed to specific treatments per se.
Okay. As I was starting the book, not too far into it, I do what I sometimes do and cheat and go to the back, and I like looking at bibliographies, and I looked at your references, and I ran through them to get an idea of what was coming. And I was struck that everything was about environmental factors that affect our health. And, and you can define that, widely as you do, from, like your diet, the microbiome, sleep, things as hard to measure as visual stimuli, things that give you pleasure, and as detailed and as microbiological as the mitochondria, grief and sleep and all this stuff, and then it all laid out chapter by chapter, not always in a straight line, but I just found that cool. I don't know if you have any comments on that, and I don't really have a specific question, but I just like the way you laid out how those things affect our body ecology and our immune systems.
Thank you. Yeah, it just underscores how dynamic we are and how dynamic diseases and health are. So, like, one thing is that, for example, for diet, what was the ideal diet for me 5 years ago is going to be very different than what it is now, because I'm a very different person. And so what we'd like to do is just have kind of a simple answer, or just tell me what to do. But then, we evolve and we change, and so things are going to change, and we don't want that. It makes it really complicated. And so it's, chronic diseases it's very different than acute infections and acute trauma. It is this constant dynamic unfolding and evolution. And so what we're seeing with COVID actually is that there's the acute infection, but a lot of what it's doing is uncovering underlying imbalances that might have been there for a long time. So that, the most crucial difference between those who have mild disease or asymptomatic disease and those with more severe disease is really the strength of the immune system and the stability of the immune system. The initial dosage, the exposure of the virus is also important, but really once you have that, what is that big difference? And so we begin to really look at how do we decrease the overall inflammatory load so that you don't get this massive inflammatory response, right? How do we strengthen really what's happening is it's affecting the blood vessels the most, even in the lungs. It's really causing these, inflammation in the blood vessels. So how do we begin to heal the blood vessels? So this has totally shifted the paradigm of any sort of genetically predetermined diseases. It's really about predispositions. And then, as you said, this whole dynamic soup that we're sort of swimming in terms of internal stress, external stresses, pollutants, infections, and whatnot.
I haven't read your ebook yet, but I glanced at some of the things. Do you want to describe the shields, inner and outer?
Yeah.
And what you're doing for your COVID patients?
So there's a free ebook. It's available. It's on my website, www.cynthialimd.com, and that's CYNTHIALIMD.com. And really kind of exploring, I talk about the two shields. And so, largely in the media coverage, it's about the outer shield. It's this, how do we protect ourselves from getting exposed to the virus, right? So that, exactly, and it's incredibly important. The masking, the hygiene measures, the distancing, and but that really there's this internal shield, and what I just alluded to, the strength of the immune system. And so you've got the primary defenses, right up kind of at the nose and the throat, which is where they tend to seed initially before it spreads to the body. But also, if it were to enter into the bloodstream, into the body, what are ways to strengthen this immune system? So I really look at diet is always the first kind of foundational piece. Diet and stress are the two biggest ones. And so stress, one of the things I like to cite is it's estimated we have somewhere between, the very conservative measures are about 10,000, and then the upper limit is about 30,000 thoughts a day. So if those are chronically, our thoughts have a huge impact on what's happening with our genes, with our neurons, with the immune system and how it's responding. So thoughts and then diet. But I also go into key nutrients that the immune system needs to function optimally. And so oftentimes when we think about shield, we think, oh, the stronger the better. And actually autoimmunity is an overreactive immune system, right? So we don't want something overactive and we don't want something underactive. We really want it in the middle so that it responds appropriately but not overwhelmingly. So there are key nutrients. A lot of Americans are deficient when we screen for like magnesium or vitamin D. And so really talking about the role of antioxidants. Vitamin C, another big one that's been talked about is NAC, N-acetylcysteine. These are kind of really important antioxidants, and what we're learning about COVID is the damage it does to the blood vessels, it causes oxidative stress. And I mean, that's a fancy word for the process of rusting, right? So things are beginning to rust, they're rusting, and then the immune system comes in, and so you get this massive sort of attempt at repair, and the patient experiences overwhelming inflammation. So antioxidants play a huge role, or I'll say a potential role, in reducing the illness. And so, and I say potential because this is based on, we don't have randomized controlled trials on these supplements with COVID illness, but we have data from other viral infections like influenza and other coronaviruses. And then we also just have the mechanism. We understand the mechanism of disease, so we're kind of looking at it from that point scientifically.
There's so many ways we could go, but I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about Qigong. It's a big part of your own healing. And maybe you can talk about what occurred after your book went to publication and how you kind of re-upped your Qigong practice. And then maybe on a side, how much you use it for your patients.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the time too. So this is a very important piece. And so I think after this, should we open it up for Q&A?
Yeah, if Sarah has opened it up, I got some questions coming in. So
great. Yeah, I mean, Qigong is it's an ancient Chinese moving meditation, and in integrative medicine we probably call it mind-body practice. And it was one of the spokes in the wheel of my healing, and I write about it a lot in Brave New Medicine. So at the time I was practicing it about 45 minutes a day, which felt like an eternity for me, right? Just carving out 45 minutes a day to practice this mind-body practice. But I really saw it as a rehabilitation of my nervous system, right? If you have a stroke and you can't move your right arm, you could be on the ideal diet, the right vitamins, nutrients to help the nerves regenerate. But ultimately, you also have to move that arm. You have to do rehab to begin to move that arm. So I just thought, okay, I'm trying to rehabilitate my autonomic nervous system. I'm trying to rehabilitate my hormone system. So I approached it very pragmatically. And I was really beginning to experience, and I did experience tremendous healing from that. But I had a second health crisis as I was finishing my manuscript. And I allude to it at the very end, but not enough time had gone by before I understood the significance of it. And so by this point, I had, and the reasons for that are multiple, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but it was very different than the first crisis because I was already at the forefront of internal medicine, integrative medicine, functional medicine, and then really practicing intuition as well, and was still kind of left with, with really no answers. And so I dove very, very deeply into the intuitive realm and also into the Qigong practice. And part of this also brought me back to my natal religion. But really understanding the Christ as a living energy and a healing light, which is very, very different than my upbringing. So I ended up practicing my Qigong for about 3 or 4 hours a day. I mean, I really could not sit up even on the bed. My whole hormone and nervous system crashed. So I went deeply, and then I realized that earlier I had been practicing kind of transactionally, like I will practice as long as I'm healing. And what the second crisis did was the first crisis, if it was an opening of the mind, the second crisis was really a connection to spirit. So I ended up, I was practicing just to practice and connecting to, what some people might call God or the living Christ, or this life force energy, in Qigong. Healing actually became a side effect. So my healing was incredibly swift, and it was very, very deep. So I experienced a freedom in my body that I had never had, before that. And it was really classified as a radical remission. So I'm in
very different from your earlier illnesses.
Yes.
Rather than the long, slow down, or sort of fast down and then long, slow back. This is more of a V-shaped curve.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, but it doesn't sort of undo any of the other things that I learned. I had, I continued to watch my diet, but I'm not meticulous about it. And I can, I have much more freedom. But it's more that I want to, and I understand that it's good for me. It's almost like a fast if I don't eat gluten or dairy. And, I just have much more freedom in the world, moving about the world, traveling again. And so it's something that defies, I think, scientific explanation, kind of in the realm of miracles. But now that what I'm really understanding, I've gone deep into that as well, just scientifically, because my analytical mind wants to know. But it's really, it's not in the realm of mechanical physics, it's really quantum physics. And so I feel like it's not defying universal laws, it's really accessing higher laws than we're used to opening up to.
That's cool. I have a million other questions, but I am going to ask one more, and then I'm going to look over here. Are you seeing questions, or is it just me?
I don't have mine open to the questions. So.
Okay, I think it's set up for me. So I'll call these, and but I wanted to just make a point that I thought was rather amusing, and see if you had any comment about how your maternal grandmother, when apparently was an excellent student in Taiwan, was it? And her older brother, your great uncle, said, "Oh, you want to go into Western medicine because it's the new thing, and traditional medicine is based on superstition." And then she did. And then you got trained the same way, but you decided, hey, I'm going to go back and incorporate some traditional Chinese methods into my practice. Was she alive at any time during this for her to know that?
She was not. And, the interesting thing about my grandmother, my pawpaw, my mom's mom, is, it was incredible what she accomplished, right? Back in the day when a lot of women didn't go on to higher education, she went on to higher education and went into Western medicine, which was rare at the time. But it was, it was emerging, and so what she was doing was very unique. When I was growing up, I knew her just sort of as my grandma. She was long retired, and she had. We rarely talked about her being a doctor. My mom hardly mentioned it. My grandmother never mentioned it. So it wasn't even really in my consciousness. When I had told my parents I thought about going to medical school, my mom was really hesitant, and she said, you know what, my mother sacrificed her life. She was working all the time, and then she had a lot of health problems that were related to stress, you know, after she retired. And so it was not like necessarily a positive thing. I was never encouraged to go. It was I mean, in that sense, my Chinese, you know, family was very very unconventional. And so it wasn't until later, you know, when I began having these health problems and I started thinking about my heritage and like also traumas that got passed on through epigenetics, right, through gene folding patterns. And I began to ask, and then, wait a minute, and then one of the earliest healers that helped me out of that deep hole was an acupuncturist. And so that began me asking, wait a minute, you know, how come Popo never went into, did she think about traditional Chinese medicine? And then my mother started saying all the skepticism. So I realized I actually was raised in a family of skeptics, maybe prescient in some ways, but skeptical nonetheless. And so, yeah, so in a way, you know, healing is just so interesting because if we take a step back and we look at the patterns, it's really unraveling unhealthy patterns that might have been passed on to us, you know, without our even being aware of it.
I'm seeing a number of questions about supplements and vitamins. Does everybody need them? Minerals, what should I take? Stuff like that. I guess we should just say buy the book and you'll learn. There's a rather prescriptive, you know, set of, separate from the memoir part of the book, at the end, there's all the how you heal. And then there's a summation of that. There's a number of references. There's a 30-day dietary detox with detailed stuff of what to avoid and what to take. But can you kind of answer that question directly of supplements, minerals, and vitamins?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll answer it generally. I mean, that was another area I was very skeptical of. And, you know, there's this whole, you know, supplement industry too. And then, you know, how do you even know what's good quality? And it's a ton of money. But, you know, the vast majority of Americans surveyed actually take some form of a vitamin or a supplement. And so a lot of people are kind of navigating this on their own. Most of my patients who come to me are taking something. One thing that I've found is, so first off, I would say that for people who have health challenges, that there's almost always a deficiency that is hard to correct without some kind of support. And I look back, you know, at ancient traditions of healing, right? So like people used to prescribe herbs, and even healers themselves would take herbs, and they would do fasts, and they would do special diets, nutrient-dense diets. And so I feel like this is sort of the modern, contemporary way of that pattern, you know, sort of repleting things that are deficient. For people who are generally healthy, again, there's very few, but like vitamin D is one that people are almost always deficient in, and magnesium. Magnesium used to be in the water and the soil. And because of modern farming, because of soil erosion, it's just, and the decreased quality in fertilizers that go onto that soil, most people are really deficient as well. So there are a few, and I mentioned it actually at the end of my book, that I kind of recommend across the board, you know, even to children. But then the rest of it is really individualized. And one challenge with functional medicine is overprescribing supplements. And, you know, it's overwhelming. It can cause, you know, nausea, stomach irritation. I don't even know if the body can fully process all of it. So more is not necessarily better. And so what I really try to do is just to find a balance for people in terms of what it is that they need. And just like diet, like it's going to change, you know. Every few months it might change a little bit in terms of what you need and what you don't need.
Okay. How has your Qigong practice deepened your intuition? Has it made you more in tune with your own body and or personal relationships? I am an avid Qigong practitioner too.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's sort of like healing, that the intuition has deepened as a side effect of the practice. I know some people, in the lineage, I practice in Zhineng Qigong, that lineage, which is also wisdom healing Qigong. And some people in the community have actually begun Qigong sort of with intuition as a goal. And so much of intuition is also body awareness. It's just being aware of the signals of the body that are, sometimes subconscious. They're so subtle. So that the Qigong practice both helps me tune into my internal signals, but it also, as I'm understanding it now, Qigong opens the body up, particularly the spine, which is the energy highway. And so the amount of energy that comes through me or into my body through the practice is significantly more than it was like when I was practicing at the beginning.
There are a number of questions about, do you have any recommendations for practitioners of Qigong or acupuncture, or are you accepting patients? So do you have any general advice for that? Or I know you mentioned that in the book there are a number of exercises and things you can learn on YouTube. But if somebody wants to see a practitioner live, what's your advice?
To see an acupuncturist or a...
Acupuncture, Qigong, or functional medicine.
Oh, okay. So there are resources in the back. For Qigong, actually in the COVID ebook, which is free and downloadable just from the website, I have a couple of intro free practices on YouTube for people to just get a feeling for. One of them is one of my teachers. I have a few different teachers. Again, most people will enter it sort of at the level of mind-body practice, which is a wonderful way to enter it. But it goes much, much deeper than that in terms of consciousness practice. And consciousness meaning not just the conscious mind, but really the subconscious, which is embedded in the body, in the cells, in the way the genes are folded. So it's a stepwise progression. And my teacher, Master Ming Tong Gu, he has a whole, a very, very organized stepwise program that it's all online. You pay a monthly subscription, and it's just each week you get a new lesson. And so you begin to deepen your own practice at your own pace. In terms of acupuncture, it's very variable. I mean, I think most of the people here on this call are local. So there's I don't know how to recommend a particular acupuncturist for anyone, but I will say, as with functional medicine practitioners, the fit is very, very important, and it's actually more important than the skill level. And so with an acupuncturist, like I actually tried 3 or 4 top, sort of top-rated veteran acupuncturists, and almost gave up on it, just thinking that modality didn't work for me. And the very last one was a really good fit. So, not to give up, really looking for that fit.
Okay. We have a little time left. In your journey to wellness, were there any moments when a light bulb went off and you realized something very valuable immediately?
Well, there were a lot of light bulbs. That's a great question. There were a lot of epiphany moments. I would say a lot of them happened in hindsight. The obvious one, the very blatant one, was during the second health crisis, or just after. I just had much more awareness of myself and also of my body. And that particular crisis, I would describe, from what I've read about near-death experiences, it felt like a 3-month long near-death experience. Like I could really see this other realm. And I felt like I was kind of negotiating, on some soul level, like, okay, you know what? Okay, I'm going to let go of the resistance of being, a different kind of healer. Like I had really just wanted my life to go back to doing public health and just being, quote, a regular doctor. And so I kind of let go of whatever agenda it was I had for my life and just accepting whatever my path was. And I could kind of almost see it from this strange other vantage point, that I was on this journey that I have always been on, but hadn't been able to see.
Somebody mentioned Dr. Mark Hyman, who actually, one of my questions was, I had done some reading on just before I read your book randomly, and on some of his came up about different vegetable oils and which ones are omega-6 and omega-3. And then I see in your book, he was the keynote speaker at your first functional medicine conference. And he was, you did a YouTube with him last year. Would you consider him one of your mentors?
Yeah, I mean, he was not a direct mentor of mine, but he was certainly a teacher. He has really helped, if we can even call it mainstream, but really helped galvanize functional medicine into something that's much more prevalent, in people's awareness.
Accepted.
Exactly. And so, and he's a celebrity doctor. I mean, he's all over the news. But yes, I mean, I would say he's a teacher more than a mentor.
Okay. What do we got? We got 8 o'clock, maybe one or two more. Can you tell us, this is me, about the Healer's Arts program at UCSF? Are you still active with that?
I am. It is, Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, whom a lot of people may have heard of. She's the author of 2 best-selling books, Kitchen Table Wisdom, my grandfather's blessings, sorry. She was a professor at UCSF. She's now retired, but her life's work is really about the patient's story and kind of reclaiming the story as part of the healing journey. And so she developed this program that's now in hundreds of medical schools in America and also some, I believe, internationally. But really helping doctors and also nurses reclaim our calling and really holding sacred this art of healing that was really the original calling before it got sort of suppressed through medical training. And so it's beautiful. I've been part of her, there's a living room group that meets every month. I mean, now we meet virtually, but really in her living room, just doctors sharing stories. And there's this whole practice around something she calls generous listening, where we're listening, we're not just not speaking and interrupting each other, but we're really trying to quiet our minds. So questions that come up, judgments that come up, opinions, we're really just trying to silence it and kind of enter this meditative place where we're just open to receive. So speaking of skepticism, like that's a really good practice, is beginning to observe your mind as someone else is talking. And so it's been a really valuable practice with patients too, is being aware, like, I'm just going to let them talk. I'm not going to interrupt them. I have my questions, but I'm not going to interrupt them. And it's interesting because so many of them, like let's say they speak for a few minutes, and then a lot of them tend to say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I just kept talking. And I said, no, like this is your time, And so when, maybe we need to schedule another appointment to talk about, some other things, but this was really, really valuable. And so what can I learn from them? What can I learn from their stories about what may be more healing for them than maybe what my particular agenda or prescription was going to be? So it is also really one of the missing pieces of addressing burnout amongst healthcare professionals, is going back to that. We talk a lot about diversions and getting time off and, practicing pleasure, but like, what about going back into yourself and your calling and your soul, and how to nourish that? How do we talk about grief? How do we help hold each other in grief? And those are really big pieces that are missing in the culture.
Yeah, and it's a first year class, correct?
It's a what?
A first year class. They take it in their first year of medical school. Yeah.
Right. It's an elective now. Yeah.
Oh, really? Once when I saw that on your CV, I looked it up, and I read that it was like required at 90 plus medical schools now, and in their curriculum. And it
maybe. I was talking about UCSF, at UCSF Medical School. Yeah.
I have a question with some detail about some chronic illnesses, and I'll just distill to what advice do you have for someone still chronically ill and looking for answers, and that haven't been met yet by appointments with doctors so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. It's a very broad question. One thing I ask all of my patients, I've been practicing integrative and functional medicine now for 9 years. And what I've noticed, I've just seen enough patterns now. So I shifted my practice last fall, where I just said, you know what, I don't even know if I can do this, but I'm just going to do it. I basically require, I can't force people to do it, but I basically prescribe it and strongly recommend it for all my patients, even before I see them. As soon as they register as a patient, in my practice, I give them homework of Qigong. And I also say, if they have a mind-body practice, they can go back to it. But if they stop doing it, go back to it. If you have all along been practicing it, you have to find a way to deepen it or to lengthen it. And then I explain why. I've seen enough patients, a lot of patients, even in the functional and integrative medicine models, they're just cycling. They cycle through. And functional medicine and integrative medicine can be a very sophisticated and complicated coping strategy, right? So they're doing all these things to cope, to continue their life, but they're not really healing deeply. So first thing, you've got to have a foundation of a mind-body-spirit practice, period. And the second thing I ask people at the beginning of every first appointment is, what is it that you truly want? Because a lot of people, everybody says they want healing. Everybody says they don't want X, Y, and Z, right? They don't want the chronic pain. They don't want, the malaise. They don't want the high blood pressure. They don't want to take their medication. So there's a list of don't wants, which is very different than what is it that you really want. And so I give the analogy of smoking. The vast majority of patients, when I would ask them who smoke, I would ask them, do you want to quit? And the vast majority of them said yes. And I said, well, are you ready to do what it takes to actually quit? And, and I said, it's not to me, you're not answering to me. You don't owe me anything. You're really answering to yourself. And if you're not ready, then that's fine too. But just kind of consciously recognize that's a choice. So a lot of patients are actually not quite ready to do what it takes for deeper healing, because we're still mired in this one cause, one effect model, and we kind of want a drug, and I'm putting myself in there too. If there were a drug that sort of cured or sort of took away my symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome and rebalanced my nervous system, I probably would have taken it. So with so many of these chronic conditions, again, with this environmental sort of matrix interacting with our unique genes, we're going to actually have to make some big changes. The bigger the changes, the more effective the healing. So, so then that's kind of just where I start with those deeper questions, you know. And it begins, and the patient begins to lead what it is that the prescription is going to look like.
Yeah, I think my guess would be some of these people who've been struggling, maybe not quite as long as you had, but be very motivated to try things. And obviously most people, sure, give me a pill or give me a procedure that'll make it go away and boom, boom. But a lot of, you know, some of these questions and my own experience, people that have just been refractory to diagnosis and treatment and are suffering are going to be more motivated to do something different and more, you know, more difficult and challenging and require some follow-up. So.
Absolutely. And it's not,
my advice,
I mean, I did not mean that like as a judgment or anything. It's the reality. Now, what I've seen recently, and it's not for lack of want, but it's more the question of so many of us live our lives, whether we're well or not, operating actually above capacity, above what we have energy for. And so we have to ask the question, what is it that you need and can let go of? You just have to get rid of it. You know, if you're going to practice Qigong 2 to 3 hours a day, you have to let go of something, right? I'm not asking you to practice that on top of everything else that you're doing. And so what I've seen during sheltering in place days, it's actually been much easier because most of us have seen, oh my God, I don't need to do that. I don't need to do that.
I'm not on the road for an hour and a half.
Exactly. There's so many things we don't actually need to do that this sheltering in place has given us permission to not feel like we have to do because everyone else is doing it. It's been a real slowing down. And many of my patients have actually done their own healing, you know, kind of as a side effect of sheltering in place. So it's more that question, because most of the time people are too tired to do whatever needs to be done. And so the most important thing is actually just connecting to yourself. And a lot of us need permission to do that.
I wish we could go on forever, but it is 8:11. There are a number of questions. I apologize to you folks that I haven't gotten to your questions, and I'm going to apologize to myself for not getting half my questions answered because I haven't asked them. So I think it's time to wrap this up. Hopefully this has been useful and a source of inspiration and optimism. And if confronted with challenging health issue for yourself or a loved one, you'll keep asking questions and go beyond the usual approaches. Cynthia, do you have any final words of wisdom?
I mean, I think I covered most of what I wanted to say, but yeah, it's
you can say no.
Well, no, there was one, I was trying to think of which thing I wanted to close with. There was one phrase in my reading that, you know, over the years, I've just always continued reading, that really struck me. And it was a phrase by a monk, a Catholic monk, actually based down in Big Sur, and Bruno Barnhart. And he said that humans prefer manageable complexity over unmanageable simplicity. And so there is this level at which healing is simple. It's asking these deep, simple, fundamental questions. The complexity is that, you know, let the doctors figure that out. And, you know, it's a little bit, oh, what's that and what's that? But there's this very profound level at which the simplicity, it's frightening because it's unmanageable. It's really surrendering to some mystery that we can't wrap our analytical minds around. So it has, initially it was very, I struggled with that, and now I've just kind of slid into that flow. And it just gives me a lot of hope for the complexities that we're seeing at the community and the global levels in terms of all the stuff that's really coming to a head right now.
And I would just make the point that for those of us not suffering from chronic illness, at least to our knowledge, who exercise and do a lot of good things, there are still there's lots of good advice in this book to, tweak things even further. You can always get better in ways to, and like one example is just since I started reading this and describing the book to people, a number of people said, "Oh yeah, I do Qigong." And I go, "What? You're my age and you're white and you live where we live and so this is, and people share these experiences and ways to improve." So I would encourage people to get the book. It's got lots of nuance. It's got lots of good advice. Remember, you can get it at Orinda Books. Otherwise, I'll say thank you to Dr. Li for sharing your story and insights. And to everyone out there, thank you. Stay safe and good night.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye-bye, Cynthia.
Bye-bye.